Welcome everyone to my Arlecchino guide. The Knave is getting her first rerun soon, and ever since her first banner, new characters have been released, introducing some new teams. In this guide, I will go over Arlecchino's kit, her playstyle, artifacts and stats, best weapons, teams, and finally Constellations. And without further ado, let's get into her kit. Arlecchino is a 5-star Pyro damage dealer. She scales on attack, wields a polearm, and has a crit damage ascension bonus. Arlecchino deals damage through her normal attacks, which usually deal physical damage unless you have a Bond of Life, in which case her normal attacks will be converted to deal pyro damage that cannot be overridden. Bond of Life is a mechanic that locks away a part of your character's HP and requires healing to be removed. Keep in mind that the Bond of Life percentage on the HP bar is not 1-to-1 and can actually go up to 200%. When Arlecchino has a Bond of Life worth 30% of max HP or more, her normal attacks will be infused with Pyro, increasing the attack's AoE and damage, with the bonus damage scaling with the normal attack's level and current Bond of Life percentage. Each normal attack also consumes 7.5% of the current Bond of Life, so to keep dealing damage, you would need to keep gaining a Bond of Life, which can be done through Arlecchino's elemental skill. Arlecchino's elemental skill deals pyro damage to nearby enemies in a rather large AoE and marks them with a Blood Debt directive. The Blood Debt directive lasts for 30 seconds and deals pyro damage to marked opponents every 5 seconds. The damage from Arlecchino's skill and the Blood Debt directive is not particularly high, but it allows her to gain a Bond of Life. When Arlecchino uses her charged attack, she can absorb the Blood Debt directive from nearby opponents, granting her a Bond of Life worth 65% of max HP for each Blood Debt directive absorbed. A maximum of 145% Bond of Life can be gained through an instance of her elemental skill. This skill has a cooldown of 30 seconds, although it can be reduced by using Arlecchino's normal attacks. Usually her skill would be ready to use for her second rotation. A few bonus things to add to her normal attack. Firstly, her third hit can draw in enemies, and her charged attack can be instantly executed without going through her first normal attack, which is unlike other polearm users. Additionally, holding her charged attack will allow her to sort of fly over things and increase her movement speed for a limited duration. It even allows her to cross over water. Arlecchino's first passive enhances her Blood Debt directive. If an enemy marked with a Blood Debt directive is defeated before Arlecchino absorbs the Blood Debt directive, she will automatically gain a Bond of Life worth 130% of max HP. When a Blood Debt directive has been on an enemy for more than 5 seconds, it will be upgraded to a Blood Debt due, which grants a Bond of Life worth 130% of max HP when absorbed. Although the maximum limit of 145% Bond of Life is still in place, you can stack her Bond of Life to exceed 145% through repeated uses of her skill. Since the Blood Debt directive can grant a larger Bond of Life if it's upgraded to a Blood Debt due, you would usually want to start your rotation with Arlecchino's skill to allow it to become a Blood Debt due by the time you're done with your team's rotation. Using her skill at the beginning of your rotation would also allow you to swirl Pyro or trigger the Hero of Cinder City buff with the Pyro element. Since Arlecchino's Bond of Life increases her normal attack damage, you wouldn't want her to be accidentally healed, removing the Bond of Life. However, that isn't a problem due to her utility passive, which makes it so that Arlecchino cannot be healed during combat, not even through consumable items. In return, it grants a 40% Pyro damage bonus. Even though Arlecchino cannot be healed during combat, her burst can heal her, which adds some self-sustain. Arlecchino's burst deals pyro damage to nearby opponents and absorbs any nearby Blood Debt directive. It also heals her, scaling on attack and the current Bond of Life percentage, while also resetting the cooldown of her elemental skill. This burst has a cooldown of 15 seconds and an energy cost of 60. The healing from this burst can remove the Bond of Life and fully heal her, which is why you wouldn't normally want to use it unless you're low on HP. However, it also resets her skill's cooldown, which can allow you to restart your rotation. To aid with survivability, Arlecchino's second passive will also increase her elemental and physical resistance. Arlecchino's talent priority is to first level up her normal attacks. Both of her burst and elemental skill are not entirely necessary to level. Her skill doesn't deal a lot of damage and is primarily used to gain a Bond of Life. Her burst damage does not outweigh her normal attack's damage, and you would only want to use it for emergency healing, which even that does not scale with burst level. Arlecchino's playstyle is pretty simple. You would usually want to start your rotation with her elemental skill to apply Blood Debt directives on enemies, then go through your team's rotation, and finally swap to Arlecchino, use her charged attack to absorb the Blood Debt directives, and then deal damage through her normal attacks. To use Arlecchino's Pyro-infused normal attacks, you would need a Bond of Life worth at least 30% of max HP, but once you get your rotation started, you would almost always be above a 30% Bond of Life. Stacking the Bond of Life to increase Arlecchino's damage is also pretty easy, and once you start getting into later rotations, Arlecchino's Bond of Life will keep increasing even more, allowing her to deal more damage than in the first rotation. Stacking a Bond of Life in AoE and single target situations is easy, as with multiple enemies, you can gain up to a 145% Bond of Life, while in single target situations, you can gain up to a 130% Bond of Life through Arlecchino's second passive. In both AoE and single target situations, Arlecchino's performance is very strong. Arlecchino's Pyro-infused normal attacks have a large AoE, allowing her to hit multiple enemies at once. In single target, Arlecchino's personal damage is very high, making her one of the best damage dealers, allowing her to defeat most bosses in a few rotations. Since she deals most of her damage through normal attacks, there are a few normal attack combos you can use to deal more damage. Using her 5th normal attack and then dashing to skip the 6th normal attack's animation can save a bit of time. Using her 3rd normal attack and then dashing allows you to dodge more enemy attacks, as you would be dashing more frequently. However, I usually just spam her normal attacks, as that is the easiest to pull off and what I would recommend for most players, since the difference between the combos is very marginal. Since Arlecchino cannot be healed, a shield from a character like Zhongli or Citlali can help a lot with survivability. Although you don't always need one, I usually run Arlecchino without a shielder, and if you take damage, you can use her burst to heal. But a shield is nice to have. Arlecchino is a Pyro damage dealer, and in that field, there are already a lot of other Pyro 5-star damage dealers. Arlecchino is primarily compared to Hu Tao and Mavuika, and if you already have either one of these characters, you quite honestly don't need to feel forced to get another Pyro DPS. Hu Tao is the oldest unit of the three, and is still extremely strong. Arlecchino has better personal damage compared to Hu Tao. Although Hu Tao has the advantage of working with Furina better than Arlecchino does, a team with Furina and Xilonen has some of the highest single target damage in the game, potentially higher than some setups with a C0 Arlecchino. Mavuika is the newest of the three units and has the highest potential personal damage out of the three. She can even be played as a sub-DPS. However, Mavuika requires at least a single Notland character in your team, and while some of Arlecchino's best teams require the same units, Arlecchino does not require specific teammates to work. Instead, and what I think sets her apart from both Hu Tao and Mavuika, Arlecchino can work with multiple teams and does not require specific characters. Mavuika requires Notland characters, and Hu Tao works best in vaporize teams. Arlecchino, on the other hand, can work with a variety of characters, both 5-star and 4-star. She works in multiple different teams, such as Vaporize and Melt, burning with Emilie, Hypercarry and Mono-Pyro teams, and even overload teams with Chevreuse without requiring specific characters, not to mention that Arlecchino is also easy to play and flexible in her rotations. Overall, I don't think you can go wrong with either of these units, and as usual, you should pull for the characters you like. Moving on to artifacts, Arlecchino's best in slot is going to be the Fragment of Harmonic Whimsy set. This set increases attack, and the 4-piece bonus will increase damage by 18% when the current bond of life increases or decreases, stacking up to 3 times. While this is Arlecchino's best set, other sets like Gladiator's Finale can also work since she deals normal attack damage. Gladiator's Finale can be farmed through bosses and is very close in terms of damage to Fragment of Harmonic Whimsy. Other sets that increase normal attack damage can also work, like Echoes of an Offering if you're playing with low ping. In a reaction-based team such as Vaporize or Melt, you could also use reaction buffing sets such as Crimson Witch of Flames or Gilded Dreams. If you're playing a burning team, you could also use the Unfinished Reverie set, which shares the same domain as Fragment of Harmonic Whimsy. Moving on to stats, firstly, Arlecchino does not necessarily need energy recharge. While having her burst ready in case you need to heal is nice, you don't need to invest much into energy recharge, as you wouldn't always be using it in every rotation. Instead, you can focus on more offensive stats to increase Arlecchino's damage. I also want to note that Arlecchino's normal attack damage increase does not rely on how much HP is locked away in the Bond of Life, but rather the percentage, so investing in HP does nothing for her damage. As for main stats, for your sands, you would usually want to go for attack. In a Vaporize or Melt team, you could also go for an Elemental Mastery sands, if it has better substats, or if you're lacking Elemental Mastery. For your Goblet, Pyro damage is the go-to option, but an attack Goblet is also viable if it has better substats. And lastly, for your Circlet, you could go for either crit rate or crit damage, and as for substats, you would want crit rate and damage, attack, and Elemental Mastery in Vaporize or Melt teams. Energy recharge is nice to have, but not at all necessary. Before going over Arlecchino's weapon options, keep in mind that rankings can differ depending on specific teams. Weapons that increase Elemental Mastery would not perform as well in Overload, Hypercarry, or Burning teams compared to Vaporize or Melt. These rankings reflect team damage, and calculations in this video were made using the Genshin simulator. Arlecchino's best in slot weapon is her signature weapon, Crimson Moon's Semblance. This weapon has a base attack of 674 and increases crit rate by 22%. As for its effect, once every 14 seconds, when the wielding character uses a charged attack, a bond of life worth 25% of max HP will be granted. If the character wielding this weapon has a bond of life, they gain a 12% damage bonus. If the bond of life is 30% or greater, they additionally gain a 24% damage bonus. This is Arlecchino's best in-slot weapon, as it grants a bonus bond of life and increases her damage bonus. The bonus bond of life may not be properly reflected in these rankings, so in practice, this weapon should perform slightly better than what is shown here. However, it is not necessary to obtain it, as Arlecchino has multiple strong 5-star options and even free-to-play alternatives. Staff of the Scarlet Sands is her second best option in a Vaporize or Melt team, and with this weapon, you would usually want to go for an Elemental Mastery Sands. Primordial Jade-Winged Spear, Staff of Homa, and Lumidu's Elegy are all strong and decent options to use. Both Battle Pass weapons, Ballad of the Fjords and Deathmatch, are decent options, with Ballad of the Fjords coming out slightly ahead in Vaporize or Melt teams. White Tassel, a 3-star weapon that increases crit rate and normal attack damage, is also a decent pick for Arlecchino. In an Overload team with Chevreuse, where the reaction does not deal a lot of damage, Elemental mastery weapons fall slightly behind, even though transformative reaction damage was buffed. Moving on to teams, Arlecchino has many possible team comps and can work with multiple different characters. Her best teams are usually going to be Melt or Vaporize teams, but other team comps such as Mono-Pyro and Overload can also work well. Melt teams with Citlali will provide slightly more damage than Vaporize. Citlali can use the Hero of Cinder City set, reduce Pyro resistance, and provides a shield, which is nice for survivability. On top of that, since she's a catalyst, Citlali can use the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, providing Arlecchino with an attack buff. Additionally, Melt also has a higher reaction multiplier than Vaporize, but if you do already have a strong Vaporize team with units such as Xilonen, you don't need to feel forced to pull for Citlali, as she's only fractionally better. Alongside Citlali, you can use Bennett for his attack buff, and to also activate the Pyro Resonance. And lastly, you can use either Xilonen, Kazuha, or Kachina for the last slot. Xilonen's longer uptime is nice to have, but with both Citlali and Xilonen, you would usually use the Hero of Cinder City on one unit and go with Archaic Petra on the other. Xilonen in this team can use the Archaic Petra set and pick up the Pyro Crystallized Shard to provide the set's damage buff. You could also ignore that and just run both units on the scroll set, and that's what I usually do if I'm not recording gameplay, and the difference isn't huge either way. Citlali's cryo application might make Arlecchino miss some melts, but it is usually fine, and the buffs she provides are worth it. For more consistent melts, you could run a second cryo unit such as Rosaria, Shenhe, or Kaya in place of Xilonen, and such a team comp would also clear just fine. A combination I personally find better than double cryo is running a second hydro unit alongside Citlali, such as Yelan or Singsho. Running both cryo and hydro units can potentially trigger freeze instead of melt or vaporize, but aside from this possible downside, this team performs pretty well, especially with Citlali buffing both pyro and hydro. You could also run a melt team with other cryo units, such as Rosaria or Kaya, in place of Citlali. You could also make a vaporize team with a character like Yelan or Singsho, alongside Bennett, then Xilonen, Kazuha, or Kachina. Since this team doesn't have a shielder, you could also use Zhongli, Layla, or other shielders. If you're running Xilonen or Kachina, the crystallized shards can provide a shield, and while it isn't very strong, it can shield you from taking a bit of damage. You could also turn this team into an overvape team with Fischl, who provides strong off-field damage, triggering overload. Running Furina as your hydro character is not the most optimal setup, as Arlecchino does not receive healing and won't be able to trigger Furina's overhealing passive using active character healers like Bennett, which would force you to use team-wide healers that may not always be beneficial. Unless you're running a team such as Shanyun Plunge with Arlecchino, with Furina's C1 where she provides a baseline damage buff, you could start considering running her alongside Arlecchino. Hypercarry teams are very strong as well and can free up your hydro or cryo units. Bennett remains a common fixture, alongside both Kazuha and Xilonen. You could also replace either unit with a shielder. Mono-Pyro is pretty similar to a Hypercarry team, although you would be running a Pyro sub DPS like Xiangling or Mavuika, alongside Arlecchino and Bennett. For your last slot, you could go for a support like Xilonen or Kazuha, or a defensive unit like Zhongli. Mono-Pyro with Xiangling performs pretty well in AoE or in cases where you need a lot of pyro. Burning is also pretty viable if you have Emilie. Emilie deals a lot of off-field damage and can serve as a sub DPS. Alongside Arlecchino and Bennett, you could use Emilie and preferably a shielder. A team I find comfortable to play is Double Geo with Chiori and Zhongli, and you could use either Bennett or a hydro unit like Yelan or Singsho. The Geo Resonance can buff Arlecchino's damage, and Chiori can deal a lot of off-field damage. You could also switch Zhongli with Xilonen or Kachina. This team can be very strong against enemies with Geo Shields. Overload teams with Chevreuse are pretty competitive and viable to run. Chevreuse provides both attack buffs and Pyro and Electro resistance shred if the team contains only Pyro and Electro characters. Alongside Arlecchino, you can run Bennett and an Electro unit like Fischl. You can also switch Fischl with Yai Miko, and to provide more defensive utility, you could use Toma in place of Bennett. You could also use Beidou alongside Fischl for AoE content. Ororon can also be used as an Electro sub DPS to provide the Hero of Cinder City damage buff, provided you have a character that can deal Night Soul damage, such as Mavuika or the Pyro MC, to activate Ororon's Night Soul's blessing. With Mavuika, you could also use her to deal damage through her burst. And finally, Constellations. Arlecchino's C1 will increase the damage dealt through her Pyro-infused normal attacks and also increase her resistance to interruption. The interruption resistance is nice, and the damage buff is very strong. This is a strong early constellation, and between getting her signature weapon, or C1, I would usually recommend getting her first constellation unless you're running a weapon like White Tassel, in which case the signature weapon would provide more damage. C2 will make Arlecchino's skill directly mark enemies with a Blood Debt Due instead of a Blood Debt Directive. When she absorbs a Blood Debt Due, she will deal additional Pyro damage, and both physical and elemental resistance will be increased for 15 seconds. This effect can trigger once every 10 seconds. Another strong constellation and a good stopping point, providing more damage and some quality of life improvements, like the increased resistance. C3 increases normal attack level, and since Arlecchino deals most of her damage through her normal attacks, the bonus levels provide another decent damage upgrade. C4 decreases her burst cooldown by 2 seconds and restores 15 energy when a Blood Debt Directive is absorbed. On its own, it's not a very impressive constellation, but it works better with her C6 and also reduces her energy requirement. C5 increases her elemental bursts level by 3, and lastly, C6 increases her burst damage through the current bond of life percentage. For 20 seconds after using her skill, Arlecchino's normal attacks and burst will receive a 10% crit rate increase and a 70% crit damage increase, triggering once every 15 seconds. This constellation allows Arlecchino's burst to deal much more damage and makes it worth using more often. The crit rate and crit damage buffs are also very nice, providing more overall damage, a very strong C6. Overall, Arlecchino has very strong constellations, especially the early ones, and her C6. As usual though, Arlecchino is strong enough at C0, and you don't need her constellations. And that's it for this guide. I missed making an Arlecchino guide during her initial release, so I'm pretty happy to finally release one. Thank you for making it to the end, and thank you for watching.